Hello and welcome to Stream of Consciousness, episode 4. Today I am talking about NPCs and their role in the greater world of the IRL MMORPG. So, I will be exploring a few different things today, such as NPCs, which some of you know as non-player characters, which is basically, if you play a lot of games, you understand these are characters that do very little except what they're scripted to do, in the sense of if the character runs a shop and sells gear, that's all they'll ever do. You'll only ever get, a handful of dialogue lines from them. Maybe get one or two physical emotes, things like that. Very little more. I think personally that beyond this we have player characters. So, for example, a player character is somebody who is aware enough that they're in some kind of game that they behave in response to it. And I think the third level of this is what we call a game master. So a player character I feel is quite a self-explanatory term. Anybody that's played a game kind of knows what that means. I think a game master is also somewhat self-explanatory. However, for anybody that's not familiar with something like Dungeons and Dragons or World of Warcraft or any of these games where game masters are quite an intrinsic part of the experience, I'll go into a little further detail with it. So we'll start with a D&D definition of a game master. A D&D game master is somebody that helps guide the characters through the story and will play the role of an NPC should they need to, just by voicing dialogue to help create an immersive environment, so that whilst the campaign continues, the characters have a thoroughly immersive experience, and as much of the story is enriched as much as possible. The difference between that and a World of Warcraft GM is a World of Warcraft GM is somebody that exists outside the parameters of the game. So an NPC in that context, for example, in D&D, an NPC is just someone that helps moving the story along and has very little function other than as a literary device. In World of Warcraft, that's quite similar, as well as being merchants and travel masters and things like that. The next level from that would be a player character, which in Dungeons and Dragons are the people sitting around the table, except for the game master. And in World of Warcraft, that is the player themselves. Interestingly, I should note that much like a player sheet in D&D, WoW will have a player character screen where you log in. So at one point, this was a maximum of 10 characters per realm or server, depending how you look at it. That might have gone up since I last played. I was quite an active user during the I started during the end of Burning Crusade, and really got into it during Wrath of the Lich King. Played through Cataclysm a little bit, quite a lot of Mists of Pandaria, and then on and off after that, and sort of stopped. I think during Legion. The fact that I'm not sure if yeah, it was definitely Legion that I stopped. Um, yeah, it just kind of it felt too much of a time sink. But anyway, not the point. A GM in that context is somebody that isn't playing the game but can watch all the others that are playing the game and can adjust settings. So much in the same way that a game master during a D&D campaign can affect the outcome of the story by making an arbitrary decision if nobody else will, simply by personal preference of execution, as it were. In the same way, in World of Warcraft, for example, if there's a dispute between players, or perhaps you've logged in and something's happened to your account whilst you were away, hacking is not uncommon with WoW accounts. A game master can restore items or currency. Sometimes achievements can be unlocked. Say, for example, you've fulfilled all the criteria and there's been a bug in the game. If you write a ticket, a GM can sometimes respond and fix it there and then for you. So I compare these three levels to the hermetic belief system written in the Kybalion. If you haven't read the Kybalion, I do recommend it. It's not very heavy reading, but it's quite deep. It's very interesting and something that can be read several times, and I think it's definitely one of those books that will speak to you each time you read it in a slightly different manner. Just like good music will sound slightly different when you've, matured a little and grown up a bit more. The Kybalion describes three levels of human consciousness, as it were. At the first level, the Hylic, which I compare to the NPC, basically has no soul and effectively functions as a physical vessel that follows the will of the demigods if I've got that correct. I might have the naming of the gods they support incorrect, but we'll go with the general principle. You'll understand. Read the Kybalion. It'll make more sense to you. The Hylic essentially has no soul and no spirit by the Kybalion's definition, and doesn't really do much to interact with the world beyond fulfill the lines of code that they were scripted to write. Now, in a non-simulation theory world, that's the same idea as somebody basically just working the menial job for the rest of their life, because as far as they understand, they've got bills to pay, so they work the job, they make the money, they pay the bills, and that's it. They don't have to worry about much else. They're not worried about fulfilling hopes and dreams, or being creative, or discovering something in the name of science, or participating in sports and things like that. Generally, most NPCs, they might have a hobby or two, but they're not super fussed about expressing themselves in the greater world as far as they're concerned. And again, this is a generalism. As far as an NPC is concerned, their function is to support the greater good. They are definitely perpetuators of a hive mind mentality. Now, the next level, the psychic, as the Kybalion describes them, which is equivalent, I believe, to to a player character, is somebody that, by my reckoning, I think is quite aware that something's going on. Something beyond regular understanding of how society's maybe supposed to work. And you can argue this is in conjunction with the idea of when you know some fuckery is going on, or there's some bullshit going on, it's like, it's just not quite right. There's something I can't quite put my finger on that's meddling with what should be, or at least should feel to be, the natural order of events. So, for example, this might be arbitrary rulings from perhaps a corrupted game master, or a badly written script, or, sometimes it happens and it might seem like fuckery or bullshit, but you perhaps just don't understand it yet. Because a quote I recently heard from Neil deGrasse Tyson is, "The universe is under no obligation to make sense to you," and I think those are pretty timeless words, and I think we could all stand to appreciate that wisdom at every level it can. So one of my favorite Kybalion quotes is the phrase, "As above, so below." And what "as above, so below" translates to is basically like levels of organization. So if you've got something at the subatomic level, like your quarks and whatnot, then you've got the atomic level, then the molecular level, cellular level, tissue, organs, organ systems, organisms, and then all the way up through the various strata of like population, community, population, and ecosystem, biosphere. I might not have those perfect, but you get the general idea. But levels of organization work across all things. For example, in internet context, you'd have a thread on a post, on a forum, on a website, on the internet. So these levels of organization are quite a universal principle. So the idea of Neil deGrasse Tyson being, just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it's not true. It doesn't mean that it has to make sense to you, I think is an important part of the player character perspective. Because a lot of what a player character will understand to be true is really inferred from context. And because they don't have a lot of alternative context to relate it to, it can seem like the only reasonable idea at the time. It's not dissimilar to the principle of a dangerous beginner. Somebody that's very new to a discipline, or like a sport or an art or a science, that because they know a little bit, they know a lot more than somebody who's never done it. But in the greater scheme of, for example, let's say chess, somebody who's learnt the rules, understands castling and en passant, and has a basic understanding like pawn structure and piece harmony, is going to wipe the floor with somebody who's being taught the rules before their first ever game. Simply because, well, there's an experience factor at that point. And this is the dangerousness of what I call the dangerous beginner, which in jiu-jitsu is, there are some, I try not to worry too much about being specifically politically correct with this stream, podcast. I'm just going to call it a broadcast and leave it at that. It seems general enough. I essentially the term is called a spazzy white belt. I personally kind of prefer the term untamed or lively because, well, the thing with jiu-jitsu is new people can be a bit, because it's a combat sport or a martial art. There's same thing. There's six of one, half a dozen of another. Because of that, people can be very prideful and keen to prove themselves as capable warriors, or, you know, I'm a tough guy. I'm not going to take this line down, and overcompensate for it and actually thrash about and be more dangerous than helpful. So this is not an uncommon factor with what I've personally observed with what I call player characters. So a lot of player characters who are quite new to the idea of the game, the IRL MMORPG, don't necessarily understand that what they're doing when they think they're being helpful is actually detrimental long term. So this can be conveyed in a similar, like, say for example, you're going through a rough time emotionally and psychologically, and a friend of yours says, "Oh, it's all right. Come have a drink with me. We'll talk things through and all grand." On the surface, that seems quite reasonable, and in some cases can be the best course of action. However, if that friend's friend's methodology to making you feel better is just getting you drunk or high or distracted with television and not actually addressing the problem, they're not intentionally being malicious. It's like that phrase, don't attribute to maliciousness what can be equally explained by stupidity. And I think that's a fair way to describe not just white belts in jiu-jitsu or fresh player characters or well-intentioned friends. I think it's something that, we all experience in one way or another. So a thing with player characters is, because of there's a binary system going on with it simply because it's a computer system. There are yeses and nos, there are haves and have-nots, there are trues and falses, all that jazz. It's something that, the Trinity? The triumvirate? I was trying to think of a fancy word that described it in threes. Basically, the three-part model of NPCs, PCs, and GMs implicates that this is not a binary system. But an NPC will always effectively be subservient to the system they're controlled by. A player character will be voluntarily subservient when they need to be, but not necessarily universally subservient. For example, they might elect to break the rule when they see there's a greater good to it. So, as an example, an NPC might break the rule at the instruction of somebody else. The classic, is it the N word, the other N word of just following orders, but it's more than that because they're not actually putting any critical reasoning into it. Meanwhile, a player character might break the rule by their own volition. In the same context, that a GM is kind of the one that's not just making the rules, but has the option to enforce those rules. Of course, depending on what the NPC, the PC, or the GM's station is and where they're encoded, makes a really big difference to that on a greater scale. So we're going to stick with explaining the idea of the relation between the hermeticism and the simulation theory levels, as it were. So, player characters to psychics have have a soul, but not necessarily a spirit. So, from that definition, we can extrapolate that a soul grants insight, but not necessarily understanding. So, in the same way that you might be able to see something and like, oh, I kind of get how that works. Yeah, I could probably reproduce that if needs be, but you might struggle to teach it to somebody else. And the next level beyond that would be, in the Kybalion text, is what they call a pneumatic. So pneumatic to a GM is somebody with a soul and a spirit, and has enough free will that they can discern right from wrong, and they sort of write their own code of ethics, as it were. They understand that there's a greater moral principle to many functions of the universe, but part of how they interact with the universe is by their own understanding. Now, it can be tricky to differentiate and distinguish the difference between player characters and game masters, simply because a player character can appear to be a game master if they're a convincing actor, if they've studied the game thoroughly enough that they know ins and outs of what somebody in that position would do. But basically, it's a display of inauthentic behavior that's easily interpretable by a GM as a falsity. An NPC will not be able to distinguish a player character's falsity, but by the writing of the Kybalion, is what I'm relating to my understanding of a GM, is basically a GM will understand that the higher truth is more important than the personal gain, because the contextual truth, whilst perhaps helpful temporarily, ultimately, if it's not understood by the environment's population, can be akin to lying to them. It's the same idea of like, you know how sometimes you'll get like false advertising where it'll describe it as like a real estate thing. Oh, it's really cozy, it's really lovely in the winter. You get a nice blanket, read a book. Basically, they're saying it's small. There's not a lot. You couldn't you couldn't roll a jiu-jitsu session in there with it potentially breaking something or breaking a person accidentally. It's that kind of it's the sort of misleading idea of what advertising can be, which I think is a big tool in the toolbox of somebody that understands the higher levels of all this work. But it can be tricky to separate instinctual ethics from how do I describe higher realm ethics? It's the sort of thing like just because you don't like this way it sounds or the way it's worded doesn't mean it's not true. An example of that I'm going to compare is, and I'm not voicing support or dissupport for this person, is Andrew Tate. Because there was a lot of hype around him, so I thought, well, at the very least, I'll check him out and have a vague idea of who these people are talking about. And I have to say, not everything he says is wrong. Not everything he says is stupid. The way he presents that information, it's not the most palatable, and I can completely understand why some people don't like it. But to say he's completely wrong in what he's saying or how he's saying it would just be misleading. The guy is a world champion kickboxer. He is, as far as I can tell, a self-made multi-millionaire, which, let's not underestimate the difficulty that goes into that. Being a world champion anything as well is a big deal. Being a world champion in sport requires an incredible amount of not just the mental discipline which you'd assign to like learning a language or writing a movie or a book or anything like that. The physical and the mental aspect of that become into like there's never underestimate the hard work that goes into that sort of thing. Um, but yeah, he's also managed to gain himself quite a substantial public following, which again is not that easy to do. I mean, people tell you that the algorithms all work in our favor, and if you know the trends, you can follow the trends. But as much as he might be doing that, he's also consistently in everybody's face about it. But the point I'm making about how a higher universal truth is more important to recognize as the consequence of something that a player character understands on some level, but doesn't necessarily understand completely. And nobody's perfect. We're all interpreting things through our own lenses, and the accuracy through which we understand the accuracy through which people can understand how the universe really works is going to be subjective to those people's experience. It must also be noted that a pneumatic supposedly has access to higher truth, and the idea of what higher truth is it's a slightly strange thing. I define it as something that's universally true, regardless of context. It's kind of like some wisdom is contextually appropriate, some wisdom isn't. So that's what I'm trying to get at there. So a GM and a pneumatic will understand that, say for example, the principle of survival of the fittest. As I was saying earlier, the universe works in a very binary system. There is the masculine to the feminine, there is the light to the dark, there is up to down, there is left to right, there is there's life and death. And simply because we disagree with the ethical application of that binary system doesn't necessarily mean that the binary system doesn't exist. So a pneumatic will understand the haves and have-nots of it all, that for there to be a winner, there must technically be a loser. It's not dissimilar to, I think it's one of the laws of physics that energy is not destroyed or created, it's merely converted. I might be incorrect in saying that's a law of physics. Thermodynamics is ringing a bell. Not currently the point. What's more important to note is that there are some things that will remain true regardless of how politically correct it is to say them. And again, I do not want to get bogged down in politics. I am interested in philosophy. I'm interested in hearing people's opinions to discuss stuff. The modern iteration of that, which I think opinions become philosophies, become lifestyles, become politics. I think that is its own level of organization, that as you understand it deeper, you'll understand that most of the time when people are providing subjective information, it's really their politics masked. It's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just something you have to be mindful of. So as I was saying about how pneumatics work, pneumatics will engage in the world in such a way as like a game master will. Not actually, that's reasonable. If anybody's watched Star Trek Enterprise, and I know this might sound slightly off cue, but makes sense. They have what's called the Prime Directive, which is basically that they're not to interact with life at a lower level of technology. So if we think about the word technology and apply it in the sense of, if we contextually define technology as the understanding of resources and ingenuity to create solutions to problems. So for example, the technology I'm using to record this broadcast is the solution to a problem of how do I speak to many people without, for example, booking the Royal Albert Hall or the whatever thing. What's the one in New York? I'm not actually talking to anybody off screen. This is just apparently a habit I have. Madison Square Garden. That's one. Those massive concert halls where I could if you sell those out, you get all those people coming in, listening very intently to what you say. Theoretically via the internet and laptops and microphones and cameras, I can reproduce perhaps not the exact same experience, but I can create something for an audience of a similar size. And because it's rewatchable, that's in some senses immortalization, which is kind of cool. So the point I think's key to remember about how a pneumatic or a game master works is that they're not trying to do right or wrong. They're not on anybody's side except what they understand to be the moral high ground. But then morality in itself, if we philosophically wax, is slightly subjective, but by their reckoning it's more about sustaining life, creating new life, ingenuity, creativity, and not causing harm unless there is no alternative. So say for example a GM in WoW isn't going to kill a player unless that player is camping at a graveyard and using hacks to kill people. If, say for example, instead of simple add-ons to the game, which everybody has access to, and it's a simple piece of allowed software by the developers, if you hack the game and are using bots and stuff like that, then a GM might intervene and ban the player. For example, if it were in a Twitter context, a GM would be like a mod coming in and just removing players from the system because they say so. It should be to a set of pre-agreed rules or ethics or whatever. But in reality, a GM will do it by their own judgment. And this is the tricky thing with any sort of level of organization, especially as you scale that from the local to non-local. I don't think global is the inverse of local. I was going to say interplanetary because I've been looking into astrophysics recently. That's where I got the deGrasse Tyson quote from, and it's just kind of cool. But yeah, so GMs, PCs, NPCs. NPCs. So can be quote unquote awoken or enlightened, however you want to describe it, just switched on might be a word to put it, and realize there's some slightly hard truth going on, something more nuanced than their previous understanding. In the same way that, excuse me, a player character might eventually become a GM if they learn more about the universe, its functions, and how ultimately, no matter what their opinion of a certain occurrence is, ultimately they don't have the they're not entitled to make that judgment call to affect the outcome of something. If they want to, there's nothing stopping them, and that's the exercise of free will versus determinism, which is a really cool concept in itself. And you could argue to some extent that NPCs are almost entirely deterministic. Player characters are player character. This is so with the whole like dangerous beginner thing. A player character will begin to learn they have a perceivable free will, and perhaps think that all determinism is in an abolition of acceptance for responsibility. Meanwhile, a game master for like highlights for NPCs, psychics for player characters, PCs, and GMs are pneumatics, will accept that they have responsibility to maintain order and harmony, as it were. Then there's obviously the dichotomy between order and chaos, which is an interesting point, so we'll get to that a little bit later on. Understanding the maintenance of order within any sort of system is going to be somewhat subjective unless you understand the higher truth to it. And okay, so an example of higher truths are things like, say for example, you are in a very rough position and the only way that you could feasibly feed your family was to steal from a local food sales area, like a shop. If that was the only way that you had it, that let's say for example, you'd spent all your money doing exactly what you need to do, being as responsible as possible, taking care of your family, food in the fridge, heating and eating, shelter, all that jazz, and it just wasn't enough. Things had gotten expensive, you were poor, blah blah blah. In that situation, is it morally wrong to steal bread to feed your family? Personally, I think it's contextual, and I don't necessarily think it makes somebody a bad person. I think the way that somebody chooses to steal that bread would affect the moralistic outcome of that. So, say for example, if you went into a small corner shop with an assault rifle and were very threatening to everybody in the shop and demanded they get out of your way and fulfill your wishes and everything like that, versus somebody that went in with a large jacket and just placed things under and tried to walk out with anybody noticing. There's a difference in how that goes, and I think that's recognized in most legal systems. So I think it's like the difference between burglary and robbery. There's something about that in the Ant-Man film where they distinguished burglary from robbery, and I don't remember it exactly, but that they can consider that as a more moralistic differentiation. In the same way that, like, if you were to kill somebody for no other reason than you wanted what was in their wallet, it's a very different instance of murder versus killing somebody that you caught in the act of raping a family member. And I don't think anybody would be very upset with you over that. It's a lot of it is contextual. An NPC is unlikely to recognize the difference in these moralistic situations simply because they don't understand. It's not even that they don't understand. They're just not built that way. And I'm trying to say this without sounding like it's a superiority thing, because for all I know, I'm just an NPC that's coded to speak all of this and communicate all this information to you. At the same time, I might be a GM that's at the forefront of discussing this, and but then I might be a player character who is diving into waters unknown to me, but have actually been widely populated for a very long time. So I think it's important to, instead of categorizing all somewhat, categorizing what you perceive as NPC behavior as NPC behavior, when in reality it might be a player character just taking easy, or it might be a GM fulfilling a necessary conduit role. Because, say for example, you've got a GM can identify player characters much easier than a player character can identify other player characters. A player character can identify NPCs much easier than an NPC could identify it. In the same way that, like, a GM can help a player character level up in a much more efficient fashion than other player characters can help other player characters, and a player character is able to help enlighten an NPC, but at a much less efficient rate than a GM. And as long as we understand that sort of, I was going to say trionic harmony. I don't even know if trionic's a word. It sounds good, but I don't know if it's a word. So we're going to look that up right now, people. I really hope that's a word, because if it is, it sounds great. Nope, we tried. Anyway, if we consider the relationship between these three dynamics, three perceptions of existence, then we can also consider the notion that we live in some kind of computer simulation. So if we live in some kind of computer simulation, then if we behave in accordance to the computer simulation, the higher truth as it were, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, higher power can refer to a god, a supercomputer, aliens, or simply somebody that's smarter than you, or stronger than you, or faster than you, or whatever. The higher power is simply the contextually more powerful thing. And it doesn't matter if you believe in a specific god in the Abrahamic sense, like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or if you believe in multiple gods like Hinduism, or if you're more into like Buddhist and Taoism, anything like that. The idea is you believe in there's a higher power which can guide your moral compass and help you understand things in contextuality. It's one of the things where I think holy texts are a really important device for society, because they provide a basis of morality, and the idea that you can go through life without ever being subject to something better than yourself is quite I'm going to say hedonistic. The word might be, no, heuristic's learning. Hubristic, that's the one. It's pretty arrogant, put it that way. If there's nothing in your life you think can provide a consistently superior perspective to something, because there's like a meme in climbing that no matter how hard your project is, there's some 6-year-old somewhere that's warming up on it. And it's true with everything. Like, you could dedicate your entire life to programming. One day there will be a kid that just gets it quicker than you do. It's just the way that goes. It's nothing. It's nothing to detriment your own ability, but there will always be somebody better eventually. For you to be the greatest thing of all time in everything you ever do, that's the level of ability required to make that possible is beyond, I think, human comprehension, to be that capable at everything all of the time. And even then, it's like the people that are the best at stuff, say for example, the greatest athletes, the smartest scientists, the most succinctly communicative artists, the ones that can get a huge insight into society over in just a few words or a few strokes of a paintbrush. That's a very, very rare thing. And I think, slightly tangentially, the way that society has almost been spoilt with that, with the availability of things on the internet, has definitely altered the perception of the value of talent. Because it's not to say that talent is non-existent except for a few specific parameters. It's more that I think a lot of people perhaps underestimate how rare true talent really is. But then, of course, that's true in anything. In the same way that a GM is a very, very rare occurrence. Player character, I don't know the exact numbers of percentage to NPCs, to PCs, to GMs, and or of hylics to psychics to pneumatics. However, if we take, sorry, I have a slight. I tried to escape a triangle choke a little bit incorrectly recently, and it's been doing my neck. It's a lot more comfortable than it was. It's a lot better than it was, and it's continuing to improve. Just every once in a while, it's a little tight. Where was I? I was talking about talent. Oh, okay, Pareto principle. So, for those unaware of the Pareto principle, I've heard it in two ways. One is the 80-20 split, and one's the 90-10 split. If we just take it as the majority-minority idea of it, is that the majority of the work is done by the minority of the people. In the same way that the majority of talent is held by a minority of the people, the majority of resources are held by a minority of the people, and so on and so forth. So by that, if we take the idea that 80% or 90% of the entire population are NPCs, and then of the remaining 20 or 10%, 80 to 90% of them are player characters, and then of the remaining 2 or 1% roughly of that, my maths is not perfect. Feel free to do the math for me. I would genuinely say I love you for that. It's very kind of you to help me with mathematics. People that are in that sort of top 1%. Yeah, if we consider it like the top, there's the 90%, the 9%, and the 1% for simple maths, or we could have like the 80%, the 18%, and the 2%. Whichever way floats your boat, you get the principle of it, and that part's more important. So if we consider that roughly 90% of the entire human population, which at last check was not far off 8 billion people, so that's more than 7 billion are NPCs, which means of the remaining billion, approximately, well, this is not exact math, it's probably more like 7.2 billion, which means of the remaining 800 millions, 720 million, which means there's maybe 80 million game masters in the entire world out of 8 billion, which I know personally for myself, without a lot of external context, numbers like that can just seem big without meaning anything. It's like, if you're going to compare the size of the universe to something, it's useful to know how many things fit in the size of the universe. Like, so for example, if I say something is 3 football fields long, you know that's about 300 meters. It's a little bit easier to relate that information than just saying the strict numbers of it. But the important thing to consider there is the vast majority of people in the world, if we follow something like the Pareto principle, the vast majority of people are likely to be NPCs, which also means, odds-wise, you're probably an NPC as well. I might be an NPC, I don't know. My ego doesn't want to think it's an NPC, and, I think most of you are the same thing. My self-esteem's defense mechanisms, for want of better phrasing, would much rather think it's a GM, regardless of whether or not it is a GM. But at the same time, it's the idea, almost kind of like the idea of the id, ego, superego. It doesn't quite. That's a trinity of itself, but it's not quite the same thing. But it's the idea of no, actually, it's not far off. If the id is entirely like instinctual pleasure based, and an NPC just goes off its base programming, which would be the most simple iterations of neurochemistry, then a player character is equivalent to the ego, which is the balance between id and superego, and is quite. It's like you're listening to the angel on one shoulder and you're listening to the devil on the other shoulder and making your own opinion of it, but you're aware that there's more to understand. It kind of works. And then if you think of the superego as the inner parent that's trying to do what's best for the family, as well as understanding that sometimes specific children need a little more help than others, but at the same time, if you give a certain child more help, then you might have to compensate that in other areas, and so on and so forth. Like, it kind of works. It's not a perfect analogy, but we'll do what we can with what we've got. As I was saying, we have to understand that as much as we might personally want to believe we are GMs, and we all want to believe we're player characters, we might not be. The simple truth of the matter is we might not be. So, if we are NPCs, maybe we should just focus on being the best NPCs possible. Because if we do that, then at least we're doing the best we can to become a player character. Or if we're already a player character, then we're still behaving the same way that would move us towards being a game master. It's the idea of that consistent self-improvement. And I know the whole self-improvement thing is, some people consider it a bit of a meme, but I think my personal opinion on that is that's actively a disinformation campaign to discourage people from actually trying to make themselves better, because there's a lot of people in the world that will react negatively to somebody that's doing their best to actually get out of a bad situation. There's a good lyric I heard somewhere. It's like, everybody wants to make it, but nobody wants to see somebody else make it. I'm probably butchering that slightly, but the principle of it's not dissimilar. It's almost like everybody wants to become a player character or a game master, but NPCs almost have that crabs in a bucket mentality of, if not me, then nobody else can. Meanwhile, but then it doesn't help the greater good in that sense, and I think that's one of the principles you have to learn if you really want to become wise, or a good role model, or an outstanding member of your community, or just simply a more well-rounded person. You need to accept that it's like sometimes you're the hammer, sometimes you're the nail. Sometimes you just have to be the student to the master. Sometimes you have to be the child to somebody else's parenting. Sometimes you need to be the servant to the master. You might not want to be, and I don't think anybody wants to forfeit their autonomy in that sense. But if you can accept that you will not always be in complete control of your destiny, I think generally that's very healthy. I think it's a very good way to sort of relinquish control anxiety. Again, these might not be perfectly clinically accurate terms, but as far as I personally understand them, and I think contextually they make sense, I'm sure we can find an agreement. I think I've said most of what I want to say on the matter, and I've got most of it out. So if we consider that, is there any sort of interesting note we can end on? Any sort of, as Mr. Clarkson would have put it, a bombshell to end the show on? Well, if we continue the idea that we do all live in an IRLMMO, and some of us are NPCs, some of us are PCs, some of us are GMs, then regardless of whether or not we're a non-player character, player character, or game master, we have to consider that within the game, what are the reward functions that the game provides? And you can look at that a lot of different perspectives. You can look at that as a purely biological thing of what does human neurochemistry reward, and then you can look at stuff like dopamine or serotonin or epinephrine and all these various components to neurochemistry. Or you can start thinking about the morality of it. It's like, how do we define, is meaning something that fuels our dopamine circuit? Is what we understand as meaning something that's essential to having, as Aristotle would describe, the good life? He would also describe having the good life as having, what was the phrase? You needed to have a value system within that to actually effectively have a good life, because otherwise you're just living a life. That's an interesting point, though. It's kind of like, regardless of whether or not you are, regardless of what level you're on, if you behave with the intention of bettering yourself, regardless of reward of leveling up, then that's kind of how you level up, as it were. You level up by not needing to. Yeah. It's in the same way, like, if you get a promotion at work, yeah, you can harp on about how you're the best person for the job and nobody else even comes close to your capabilities, but you've actually got to demonstrate those capabilities. And most of the time, if you need a marketing campaign to demonstrate your efficacy to your superiors, then maybe you're not quite as superior as you thought you were. Meanwhile, if you're able to demonstrate your efficacy regardless of day of the week or mood or anything like that, then yeah, you've got a consistency with you that will be recognized by those who are in power. Of course, there is to some degree a dependency on a capable system, but then that in turn becomes an issue inherent to a system. So if we consider the IRLMMO RPG that we live in to be, we'd have to assume it's designed well. So because it's a combination of man-made technology and naturally occurring biological phenomena, then we have to wonder, at the end, does the technological manifestation of mankind represent the biological imperatives that are part of being human? Or is it such a simulation, so is it so deeply a simulation that no matter what we're trying to do, we are responding to algorithmically defined reward functions? But then of course you can argue that neurochemistry rewards itself on the basis of reward functions. For example, it's like, I have a personal idea about how addiction works, is that it's basically, before we had to consider societal responsibility, the family unit worked in such a way that, you know, when you got surges of neurotransmitters, it was the result of genuinely survivalistic behavior, things that would actually keep you and those in your bloodline alive. Because even like speciesly, what's the word? Even in reference to the species, if you go back far enough, there was more concern about whether or not the individual bloodline would survive more than the species as a whole. But then if it was your species versus another species, then obviously there'd be prioritization with that. So then if we look at that in the idea of the biological versus the digital, how do we distinguish biologically occurring phenomena from digitally occurring phenomena? Can we separate those two? Or do we accept that most, if not all, digital phenomena are a result of biologically inspired, are all biologically inspired? Excuse me. That's a tricky one. Is the IRLMMO RPG and the way that we perceive the world as simulation theory or singularity or just, you know, the evolution of mankind? Is that, instead of trying to read so deeply into it that I come up with some sort of poignant, potent, profound realization, maybe it doesn't. It's one of my favorite phrases is that if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, maybe you don't understand it very well. I like to think there's levels of organization to that, of like to an 18-year-old, 15, 12, 9, 6, because sometimes things are so complicated that a 6-year-old might simply not get it, but a 9-year-old will get it if you can use broad enough strokes. A 12-year-old, 15-year-old, 18-year-old, it's in the same way that like sometimes you want to explain something to a kid that's just not appropriate for their age group, and it's, yeah, that's the whole sort of, it's like everything I've talked about in this video, bearing in mind I know I've used a few expletives, I think would definitely be understandable by most 18-year-olds, probably most 15-year-olds. I think to the credit of most 12-year-olds, likely understandable. I don't know if most 9-year-olds would be able to understand it. But then, if those 9-year-olds have access to a dictionary and are, pausing the video and rewinding it every once in a while, then there's no reason why not. And this is the sort of thing I think is relevant to the idea of how we behave in reference to, NPCs or what we like lower level player characters. Just because, like, what's obvious to some isn't obvious to all. And, like, let's say you're level 25, you're level 32 or 33, then you're going to understand things that someone at level 10 or 11 has just figured out. You understand that so thoroughly that you'd be able to teach the level 10 to teach it to a level 1. And then, that's the whole idea of communicating information effectively. It's like I was saying earlier, the universe is under no obligation to make sense to you, but if we work together, we can make the universe make sense to everybody. And if we can make the universe make sense to everybody, then we increase the understanding of future generations, which then means that humanity accelerates its general understanding. And if humanity can accelerate its general understanding, then the average intellect is increased with that. Not dissimilar to how, like, average IQs increase. Stuff that we'd consider general knowledge now, or common sense. If you go back, 30 years, it's very probable that most people didn't even know what that stuff was. You can't hold that against them for not knowing something. There's nothing wrong with not knowing something. Anyway, I think I've said more than I need to on the matter. I think I've covered quite a few interesting points. I will obviously be continuing some of these points in future broadcasts. And something I've actually been thinking about doing is doing like, so for example, last one I did was subtext and doublespeak. I might do that as a part 2 version to it. I'll have to do like a little bit more prep before it. I hope everybody's enjoyed what they were listening and watching to today. If you feel like liking, subscribing, commenting, sharing, saving onto your hard drive, drawing a homage, or simply just, downloading onto USB drives and then mailing it through people's letterboxes, you do you. I'm not going to stop you. If you liked what I've done, tell people about it. I'd appreciate it. And if not, cool. I mean, you can tell me why. Maybe we can figure something out. Have a lovely day, everybody, and see you next time. Bye.